All right. Official good morning. Welcome to all. Today is Tuesday. Unadi is here. Good morning to you. Tifshin Sana is here. Good morning. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. And Mark is here. Morning, Mark. Okay, let's dive into where we were. So, yesterday we finished watching V for Vendetta, right? And I think we've answered most of these questions anyway. We saw, of course, that there were kind of two, how should I say it? The story of this is one of authoritarian governments, right? Right? So, Miles and Jim and Daniel, can I ask you an honest question? And I'm really curious about this. Why do you come to school? Because, like, you're not paying attention to what I'm saying up here, and I'm fairly certain that what's on your screen is not this. So, yeah, like, I'm kind of wondering, like, what is the point of coming here? Like, getting out of bed and getting dressed, and you got to come all the way here, and then like to not listen to anything that's going on, like why bother? Oops. I'm serious. Like why come? Like if you're not gonna, like, why go to all the trouble and then not do anything? That seems weird to me, but I don't know. I don't know. Is it boring? Have we done this stuff before, or like what's up? Hmm. Okay. Well, maybe you can think about that and let me know a little bit later, because I'd be curious to know. Anyway, where I was, we were talking about this sort of story of this film, right? And the idea that this is a story of how an authoritarian government takes control, right? And how did they do that? How did we go from, a democracy like we know the UK to be, to this sort of authoritarian, totalitarian dictatorship in Britain? How does that happen in this film?
They created the virus, and like they were the only ones that had the cure.
Yeah.
So they were like, give us the power, or no one gets the cure.
Well, yeah, but I think it was a little more.
But they did it more slyly.
It was, yeah, it was a lot more nuanced than that, right? So behind the scenes, that's definitely true, right? They had created a virus, they had created the cure at the same time, and they found a way to use that. But really, what was it? What tool did they use and continue to use?
Propaganda.
What's that?
Propaganda.
Propaganda. But what was underlying the whole thing? How did they gain power, and how did they maintain it?
All those non, all the thing
Huh? The,
enforcement.
yeah, there was a lot of enforcement. There was the army. There were those fingermen. There were government agents. There was propaganda, right? There was the use of this virus and the cure that magically they, happened to discover very quickly, but of course they already had it. But what keeps these guys in power the whole time?
Fear.
Yeah,
Fear.
yeah, right? It's all about fear, right? And every time when the government wanted more power, what did they do?
More food.
More fear, right? So of course the virus that sets all of this in motion, that was scary, right? I imagine that the St. Mary's virus that's in the movie is far worse than COVID, right? And so yeah, I imagine people panicked, right, when this virus showed up, and of course it showed up in a school, right? People pay attention, right? People get scared, people get panicked, right? And then, yeah, what did they do? Along comes this government that promises to restore order, right? And, to halt the chaos. And they do, right? But they use that fear to gain power, and then they maintain through it, right? Everyone, when they're in the chancellor's meeting room and he's on the big screen and his ministers are in front of him, fear, right? Fear rules that room, right? Everyone is afraid of Chancellor Sutler, right? And outside of that room, everyone is kind of afraid of the government, right? Because the government is constantly listening and patrolling and checking up on people, right? And every time that it seems like something's going to happen, the chancellor says, we need to remind everyone why they need us, right? And what shows up on the news? Well, there's another outbreak, there's more war, there's more threats to the country, right? And so every time the government feels like it's losing power, it stokes people's fears again, right? And so that whole process of V and then of Evie and what Evie goes through with her kind of fake but real torture is the removal of fear, right? He does something brutal to her, and we could talk about that if you want, but she gets over her fear, as does everybody in the end, right? And so, but it's important to think about and remember, right? Because there's a lot of things that are fictional about this movie, right? We have this like superhero-like guy in a mask, and he gets shot 1,000 times and he doesn't die. Because ideas are bulletproof, which they are, but humans are not. Humans are highly unbulletproof. You ever notice? Well, you've noticed that in the movies, right? Where like you want to kill a bad guy and you just shoot him and he's dead, and then the hero you've got to shoot like 1,000 times and he's still alive. Humans are very soft and fragile. We don't take much to kill. But there's a lot of things in this movie that are fictional and that are fake and that are kind of, beyond belief, right? Fantastic, if you will. But there are a lot of things in this movie that really are not. And the way that the government goes about taking power, the way that they keep tabs on their citizens, the way that they keep control through fear and misinformation and propaganda, none of that's fake, right? That is all right out of the textbook of authoritarian governments, whether you look at the Nazis, whether you look at the Soviet Union, which we'll look at next, whether you look at North Korea, whether you look at China, right? These are governments that keep very close control of the people within their borders, and they in part use fear to maintain that control, right? Sometimes it's fear of something inside, like the virus. Sometimes it's fear of another country or some other countries. For Russia, it will definitely be that, right? Russia will always fear that the West is trying to destroy it, or has always felt that. And so Putin still uses that today, sometimes very carefully, right? He sort of plants a seed that, the West would like to see Russia fail, right? The West would like to see Russia collapse. And the Soviet leaders did that before him, right? And so, again, there's a lot of fantastic things in this movie, but the way the government operates is not one of them, right? That's textbook authoritarian government right there. And we talked a little bit yesterday about V, right? About, he's a terrorist, right? But we find ourselves kind of cheering for him anyway. And so, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but is terrorism ever warranted? Is it ever a good thing? Because I'll admit, I was cheering for him.
Yeah. But in real life, I don't think there's ever been a case where
I think in real life it happens. No one opposed
It's what?
It's a good thing that happens. Can be called terrorism.
Oh, so if it's a good thing that happens as a result, then it can't be called terrorism. See, that's tricky though, because
that's a protest.
that's it.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of argument is the ends justifying the means, right? So that's the idea that it doesn't really matter what you do as long as the outcome is good, right? But that's dangerous.
Like terrorism is defined as like something done, and I compare it done for political gain.
Yeah.
Would you say what Donald Trump did last year when he lost, or earlier this year when he lost the election, like stormed the White House and like destroy stuff? Would that be considered terrorism?
No, that would be, well, had they been a little more organized and not foolish, that would have been an insurrection, right? So a rising up against the state. And had they been actually organized and intelligent, it could have actually been an overthrow of the state. And in many other countries that are, have democracies that are sort of corrupt and not as strong, it might have been, right? Like if that would have happened in, Venezuela or something like that, that would have been a coup. That would have been an overthrow of the state by the people, right? And so luckily for the US, they have, a very strong democratic system, which Trump kind of tested the limits of, and those guys were a bunch of bozos and weren't really organized. So that was an insurrection, maybe, or
But definitely not terrorism.
not really terrorism. No, terrorism usually, and usually it doesn't come. Usually it's kind of against the state rather than, or a state rather than like within it, right? So yeah, Trump was kind of part of the government, and it would have been hard for him to commit an act of terror against his own people. Like that would be, I think you would reserve terror for like someone on the outside attacking the state, sort of thing. So yeah, that was an insurrection or an uprising. In more fragile states, it would have been an overthrow or an attempted overthrow, but really what it wound up being is shocking, but also ridiculous. Like they had no idea what they were doing. But yeah, it's tricky, right? Because yeah, does the ends justify the means, right? We know V was trying to do something good, but I would suggest that every terrorist thinks they're trying to do something good, right? What do they say? Everyone's the hero of their own story, right? Everybody thinks they're the good guy, right? Hitler thought he was the good guy. So, we can't decide based on what the people think, because everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. Whether things, turn out right in the end, it's like, well, yeah, but how far are you willing to go, right? This government in V was also operating by the same principle, because they wanted peace and order, but look what they were willing to do to get it, right? They were, removing people from society and experimenting on them and throwing their bodies in a mass grave when the experiment didn't work out. They were keeping careful tabs on all of their citizens. They were using violence against them, right? Anyone who, went against the state wound up in a black bag and disappeared, right? So, they had a lofty goal too, right? A peaceful and orderly society. But what were they willing to do to achieve it, right? And is that what we want? Is that worth it? Is that worth, suspending human rights and, indiscriminately killing people?
When that question is so personally based.
Yeah.
So it's hard to like have a proper answer for it, because it can go like all three ways.
Yeah, I love questions like that.
Yeah. I just never know how to answer them because it's
I know. Those are the best
it's
ones.
gonna come out. It's gonna come out.
But those are the best questions, right? The question when I say, like, when did when did World War II end? What year? Yeah, 1945, right? Big deal. You don't learn anything from that. It's just a fact. But it's the questions that are a struggle to answer and that you can't come up with that you struggle. Those are the good ones. Those are the good questions. And so this is a good question. How do we see this guy, right? The movie framed him as a hero. Good morning. The movie framed him as a hero, and yet, on paper he's not, right? He was one guy who decided to start blowing things up because he didn't like the way the country was being run, right? Turned out eventually a lot of people agreed with him, but in real life, on paper, that guy's a nut, right? Some guy out there who thinks that, the government's not being run correctly, so he's going to blow up the legislature in Victoria. That guy's a loon, right? But again, here the movie frames him as the hero, right? And of course, it doesn't hurt that he speaks in poetry all the time with a very classy accent, and he's very elegant, right? That doesn't hurt, but yeah, interesting, right?
Oh, yeah, it was November the 5th, right? Wasn't that like when Guy Fawkes did something as well?
Yeah. So the original movie starts out. The movie starts out, if you remember, back in I think the 1600s, when 1600s maybe, when a bunch of terrorists, I suppose, have a plan to blow up the Parliament buildings in London, right? So this is a historical fact, and there was a group of them. They got all the explosives below Parliament, and I think Guy Fawkes was the one who was supposed to light it and run away, but somehow the authorities found out. All of his co-conspirators ran away and disappeared. They caught Guy Fawkes kind of ready to light the fuse, and they tried him and hung him for treason. So that's all historical fact. That really happened.
If I'm not wrong, the UK does celebrate Guy Fawkes, right?
Th-
Something like that?
They do.
Like fireworks and stuff, if I remember correctly.
They do. There is a Guy Fawkes Day. Now, that's a little that I can't answer. I don't know why they celebrate it. Seems like you shouldn't celebrate a
I'll try to
terrorist.
find out.
Yeah.
I'll let you know.
Okay.
No, definitely.
Is there anything else that we should talk about in connection with this movie? Terrorism, governments, viruses, vigilantes, Hitler.
Hitler is not the,
Say again?
compared to Hitler is not the.
Oh, well, I think it's pretty clear that he is modeled off Hitler, right? There's, yeah.
Like the way the government is running the place and everything, kind of gives off like communist view.
Yeah, it's also like the way he ran his own army, excluding the UK army.
Yeah.
It was the same as that.
There's a heavy amount of Nazi Germany in that government.
Yeah.
Yeah, but again, also the Soviet government as well. There's, that government is heavily inspired by both the Nazis and by the Soviet communists.
Oh yeah, also like when he was talking to these people,
What's that?
like when he was talking to these people, like the public speeches he was making.
Oh yeah,
Say, like, yeah,
yeah, very like
Yeah.
passionate and yelling at people.
He kind of looks like Hitler as well.
Yeah, and he looks a bit like him too.
Or even the name, the name.
Adam Sutler, Adolf Hitler. Yeah, actually, that's a good observation. But yeah, he's heavily.
I mean, like if you compare the two body languages when they were giving speeches, it's very similar.
Yeah.
if you compare the lady, who was in the, is it the Messiah? What should I call it? The place where they used to put these things. No. Yeah, the lab. The lady in the lab.
Yeah.
Can you compare it to the lady? We even read about her in the book who been creating bombs for the Nazis.
It was the chemist.
Oh yeah,
The chemist that was trying to create the nuclear weapon.
Oh yeah.
Was it?
yeah, I think so. Who made the gas bomb?
Oh, the gas chambers.
Oh yeah, could be, right? Lots of, and that's interesting too, is that, you know, because we asked this about Nazi Germany, right? We said that a lot of people die under Hitler, but Hitler doesn't kill them all, right? So how does Hitler get so much cooperation, right? How does he get everyone to go along with this? And partly through fear, yeah, but partly, like, the woman doctor in this movie is a good example of, she thought she was doing the right thing, right? She was like, these people are volunteering and they've come here and they're, contributing, and we're gonna, like, make the world a better place.
I feel like that's quite often, even nowadays, with some stuff, when people testing that's going on. Usually doctors don't know anything; they just assume everyone's volunteers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, people assume the best, right? They're like, oh, the government wouldn't ask me to do this,
See no evil, hear no
for
evil.
this reason, right? I'm sure it's, the outcome of this is going to be good. But again, scientists don't get to decide how their discoveries are used, right? And again, we talked about Einstein and his, E equals mc squared equation being not necessary for nuclear weapons, but it helps describe what, one of the principles of mass being equal to energy. But I'm sure, he wasn't trying to create a weapon. He was trying to describe the nature of the universe, right? And so that's the other thing about scientific research too, is that, scientists might, well, think about all the genetic research that's going on in terms of, editing or changing the human genome, right? I'm sure that all of those researchers are trying to, cure cancer, right? Or make people less susceptible to genetic disease. I'm sure they're trying to improve people's lives, but, they're not going to get to choose how that technology gets used, right?
Are they making like superhumans?
No,
I hope not.
no. As it turns out, modifying human genetic code is really difficult, and so people are still learning how to do it.
It is possible with genetic chimeras.
Yeah.
But those are natural. They naturally happen.
Well, they're working on all sorts of things now, right? But that's the thing, is that, they won't get to choose how their discoveries are used, right? And so, yeah. So that's the other part of the equation too, right? Okay. So, enough about this. Let's move on. Not last time, but I think probably Tuesday, maybe on Wednesday or Thursday of last week, maybe Wednesday, I had asked you to read this section of the textbook, right? On the Pacific War. And so we said that Japan was going through the same kind of industrialization process as the European powers went through years before. Again, Japan's a little bit, gets to it a little bit later, but they are, they're going through the same process. And so they're trying to gain access to raw materials, mostly in Manchuria, but in other places in Southeast Asia as well, right? So as part of their plan to kind of create a Southeast Asian sphere with Japan at the center, they attack the US, right? And again, they have a similar plan to Hitler, right? Both the Nazis and the Japanese think that they're going to start a war, fight it out for a few months, call a timeout, and then negotiate what they want, right? But of course, both Hitler and the Japanese find out that indeed that's not going to happen, right? Both of them are going to be faced with a war that they're ultimately going to have to surrender unconditionally to.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Say Hitler won the war,
Yeah.
and Japan won the war in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Do you think the two, like Germany and Japan, would have gone to war with each other, or would they have come to terms of like, I'll like have this side of the world, you have that side of the world?
I suspect they wouldn't come into conflict for a long time. But it's almost impossible to imagine a world like that, right? Because again, these, like the success of the Allies against Nazi Germany, what happens to Japan at the end of the Second World War, the creation of the Soviet Union, which we'll talk about very quickly, those things are so massively influential. I don't know how to think about the 20th century without those things, right? If those big things don't happen, I don't know what the world looks like, because they're huge, right? They're absolutely huge in terms of creating the world of today. And so, yeah, if Hitler wins, I don't know what kind of a world we live in if Hitler wins, right? Again, if the Soviet Union never happens, I don't know what the world looks like. It's just there's no peace without war. That's one of those things that sounds really deep, Andre, but is it? But is it? If I like hit you over the head and I'm like, oh good, now we can have peace.
But I think we appreciate peace more because of war.
What's that?
We appreciate peace more because of war.
Could be. Could be.
An example is like Rwanda.
Like what?
Rwanda.
Yeah.
Like the genocide happened, but now it's
Yeah.
so peaceful there.
But I guess the question is, did that need to happen for Rwanda to get to that place?
I'm sure if it didn't happen, it wouldn't be the country it is right now.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, like you probably couldn't overstate how important that event was to Rwanda, right? That's a big event. And that one that probably affected everyone in a personal way, right?
But then sometimes war can be excessive, like it can be too much that peace can never be perfect.
It can never be.
You never get it again.
So-
Never get peace again.
You can never get peace again if.
Maybe the war is too much. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Maybe. It's a difficult process, right? And Rwanda's gone through. Yeah. And Rwanda's history is pretty interesting because, like you had a genocide, right? And almost everyone was at fault, right? It wasn't just the military or like the regular people were involved, and so like how do you?
The regular people are the ones who take the
Yeah, but how do you like come back from that, right? How do you heal when so many people are involved?
You have to get like good leader.
You have to get what?
Good leader.
Yeah.
Because most of the guys that who saved them, they went they were from the countries that they studied in America, went back there.
Yeah.
They forget. And now he's still the president right now.
Yeah, but he's facing some trouble, right? Paul Kagame?
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's facing some trouble, is he not?
Oh, right now.
Or very recently?
Not really.
I forget what was going on with him.
I mean, for my country, Burundi is in trouble for a while.
Burundi's in trouble
Yeah.
again, or still?
No, still.
Still?
Just no one knows it.
That's true. Yeah,
Most things are happening in the West, but no one knows.
I imagine most Westerners could not point out Burundi on a map,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true.
Unfortunately. That's all right. We got off track there. That was interesting, but we got off track. So the Japanese want to create this sphere. They attack the U.S., right, hoping to fight for a little while and then gain some negotiation time. It doesn't happen, right? The Americans, start the war with the intention of ending it, right? And so eventually the Americans kind of leapfrog their way toward Japan, winning battle after battle. Finally, they're confronted with a decision of how to deal with the island of Japan itself, right? The main island of Japan. And so they have two kind of, sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead here. Yeah. They have two kind of main options in front of them, right? A full-scale invasion or using these new nuclear weapons that have been developed, right? Of course, we know that they use the weapons, right? They call for a surrender. They drop the first one. When they don't receive a surrender, they drop a second one, and then that ultimately results in Japan's surrender, right? And so, yeah, the war will be in the Pacific will be over. Again, I apologize for giving it such a short treatment.
I had 3 years.
Yeah, well, and it's hard to talk about in concert with what's happening in Europe, because even though they're
It's totally two different things.
it's two different
like
things.
Wars in itself.
Yeah, like you've got some of the same characters involved, but they're not really that connected, right? So yeah, it's but this is important too, right? This is the end of this, because this is going to usher in an atomic age, right? And the presence of nuclear weapons, the development of them, and the kind of overproduction of them by the US and the Soviet Union, that's going to have a big effect on the rest of the 20th century, right? But of course, to tell that story first, we've got to talk about Russia and the Soviet Union, right? Because we've kind of ignored them so far, right? They had a role to play in World War I, of course, and in World War II, but we haven't really talked about what was going on internally. And there's an interesting story to be told there as well. And in the process, we can deal with China, right? Because the rise of, or the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, I think, is going to have something to do with the Soviet Union, right? And so we can kind of talk about what happens with China and with Mao in the process of talking about Soviet Union, okay? I'll also say I have a little soft spot in my heart for Russia, not the Russian government, they're criminals, but Russia itself, because I went there for 6 years in a row, so I've spent about a full year in Russia, and I have a
Fluent in Russian.
Niet, but
You speak Russian.
I learned a little bit. I took 3 years of university Russian, so I could get around, like I could, call, talk on the phone and ask people things and find directions and eavesdrop on people on the bus, and like I could do a little bit, but I've forgotten quite a bit, unfortunately. But I have a soft spot in my heart for the Russians, so I'll try not to spend too long on this story. So rewind back a little bit, right? We talked about at the end of World War I, we said that this was kind of a changing world, right? And politically it was changing because we used to just have monarchies, right? And so there were kings and queens running countries. And then we had democracy, right? So the French Revolution in the 1700s, created this new democratic republic. The Americans, of course, were inspired by this, and they created a democratic republic too. And so we kind of had we had monarchies, and then we had democracies, right? And sometimes we had constitutional monarchies, which was, a little bit half and half. But we said that 2 more political systems come out of this era. One of them is fascism, which I hope we are very familiar with at this point. And the second, of course, is communism. Yeah, brand new political systems. So if you don't know, communism is based on the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Okay, so Marx was kind of an academic kind of guy. Friedrich Engels was kind of academic too, but he was also a factory owner, which is a little ironic considering what I'm about to say, but that's who he was. This is Marx himself with his epic beard. As you can see, he's born in 1818. He's going to die in 1883. When he was alive, his writings were not really noticed by many. Okay, so he wasn't a rich man. He was sleeping on people's couches quite a bit. Yeah. So he was, he kind of died thinking that, his work was worthless and unimportant, right? As it turns out, it was hugely important.
200 years later, still studying his work.
For certainly for world history, his writings have been incredibly important. And even in academia, if you take psychology or sociology or anthropology, there are Marxists in those disciplines, and they kind of look at what they're studying through the lens of Marx. And so he's tough to get away from. He's hugely influential. He writes only two books, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, although it's described here as a pamphlet. If you ever read Marx, it's very interesting, but be prepared for a difficult read because he goes on and on and on, and he uses lots of commas. And so, by the time you get to the end of a sentence that's this long, you're like, what are we talking about again? But he's tough to read, but he's...
Tough as in tiring or tough?
What's that?
Tough as in tiring to read or?
Both. Exhausting and just like... Yeah, it's difficult to keep track of what he's talking about. But anyway, hugely influential. And his whole idea comes out of a period of kind of rapid social change. So when, Britain and France and Germany, when they're industrializing, right? So they're building factories, they're collecting raw materials from around the world. People are leaving their farms that they've worked, their families have worked for centuries, and coming into the city and living in little apartments and working factory jobs. That's all kind of happening in a very short period, and Marx sees that, right? He's got a front row seat to that kind of thing. And in watching this sort of factory economy, he felt it was exploitive, right? And so, I think I may have used this example already, but if we work in a travel mug factory, right, and you all are my employees and I'm the owner of the factory, if we make $1 million next year from manufacturing these things, who keeps the $1 million? I do, right? I'm the owner of the factory. That's how capitalism works, right? To the owner go the spoils, right? To you guys, you get your hourly wage, right? Maybe I'll throw you a nice Christmas party.
Not even a bonus.
I'll send you some Christmas meat. It's the best I can do for you. Now, but that's the thing, right? Is that capitalism rewards the owner and not the people who actually do the work, right? Look at Amazon, right? Look at Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos makes millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars every second, right? The people who work in his warehouses do not, right?
Is he still the richest man?
I think it's between him and Elon Musk. I don't know.
He lost a lot of net worth after the divorce.
Musk
No.
or Bezos? I don't. He's still got more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, right? But again, Jeff Bezos makes a lot of money. The people who work for him, not so much, right? And Marx looked at this and said, this is unfair, right? Why should the benefit of your labors, all you guys working in my factory, why should you lose the profit of that labor, right? The only reason these things exist is because of your effort, right? Why do I get the benefit? Because my name is on the lease or my name is on the company ownership? Ridiculous, right? So Marx said that this is an exploitative system, but most people don't realize it, right? And so they had what he called a false consciousness. So people were kind of working in the system and they're like, oh, well, it's the way it is. But Marx kind of imagined or dreamed that eventually people would come to a class consciousness, right? They would realize, you would realize that, hey guys, we're being exploited, right? We're working in the factory all day, every day, sweating, working hard. And Mike's sitting up there in his office, looking at his profit statements, and he's making millions of dollars. This is bull, what, right? So, hi. So Marx imagined that the factory workers, the proletariat, if we want to use his terms, the proletariat would realize this, and they would rise up. You would overthrow me, the bourgeoisie. You would overthrow me, take control of the means of production, the travel mug factory, and then you would share the profits equally amongst yourselves, right? And that would be fair, right? But again, the workers had to realize this, right? The workers had to realize they were being exploited, and then they would overthrow the bourgeoisie in a communist revolution, and then everybody would share equally, right? Sounds nice? It's fair, right? It's fair. Now, in practice, I think we know that communist states are a little more complicated than just that, right? And so the Soviet Union, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, China.
Are they still communist?
Who?
Soviet Union, Russia, China.
Russia's definitely not. Russia is a dictatorship with a democratic covering and a market economy. Vietnam is a communist state, but with a modified communist economy. China is a communist state with, again, a modified market economy.
What about North Korea?
North Korea is a...
Is that dictatorship or communism?
It is... I think North Korea is weird, but it's more of a... I think you could imagine it to be a communist state. It's got some... I think it's got some overlap with like sort of Japanese-style fascism as well, but it's run like a communist state. It's run by a single party with a single guy at the head. So it's basically a communist state, as far as I'm aware. So Karl Marx made these kind of very short, he wrote these very short books, but they were hugely influential, right? And they inspire people to try this in real life. And when they do try it in real life, this is kind of what you wind up with. So communist systems tend to have, again, like fascism, the state comes first, right? And so people's individual freedoms are subject to what's seen as good for the state as a whole, okay? So they share that in common with fascism. Even though they're at an opposite end of the political spectrum, they tend to have that in common. Same thing with power of the state. The power tends to be held by one party, the Communist Party, and there tends to be one kind of powerful guy at the head, sometimes, right? Again, they share that in common with fascism. Fascism also is a one-party state. The economic policies here, we see that, again, everything is owned by the state. And so in a country like Canada, most of the businesses you encounter are held by individuals, right? So we have a few crown corporations, right? So things that are owned by the government. TransLink is kind of owned by the government. Canada Post is owned by the government.
Hospitals are usually owned by government.
Yep, hospitals and schools are owned and administered by the government. But pretty much every business you encounter otherwise is private, right? Held by just regular people. In a communist state, everything is owned by the government, right? Everyone works for the government. All the products are produced by the government. All your money goes to the government. The government is all, right? But the idea, of course, is that the government will work it out so that everyone gets what they need and, gives what they're able to give. Again, in principle, right? In theory. Yeah, and so this kind of brings us to the beginning of Russia's story. And so at the very beginning, how's my time? Okay, we'll take a break in just a couple minutes. At the very beginning of Russia's story here in the 1900s, Russia is a monarchy, basically, right? They have a czar, which is kind of the Russian word for a king, if you will. They have a czar. They've had czars for centuries before that. But Russia's in a pretty rough state, okay? So prior to World War I, yes, they have a czar. Their family is the ruling family. There's a few kind of nobles, a few people who own land and have money, dukes and people like that. But most of Russia is poor peasants, right? They have no money, they don't own any land, they work on the land that belongs to the nobles. And we also see that Russia is not very industrialized. And so places like France and Germany and Britain, they have factories and they have technological innovations and yeah, they're industrial countries. But Russia has kind of lagged behind. They have a little bit of industrial production going on, very, very little. As I say, almost all of the country are poor peasants. And as you might imagine, they're pretty unhappy, right? That's all going to change when we get to this guy, right? Yeah, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, right? And so we'll get to him. He's the one who's going to change everything, but not yet. The Russian Revolution here is hugely significant. So this transition from a czarist monarchy to something that was almost a democracy for like 5 minutes, and then became a communist dictatorship. Hugely influential. Number one reason, Russia after the revolution is going to be totally different from Russia before the revolution, right? And what we'll see is that the pace of change once the Communist Party gets into power is ridiculous, right? So like where Russia is in 1917 versus where it is in, say, 1937, 20 years later, unbelievable, right? We see a poor, kind of broken peasant country transform into an industrial powerhouse, right? And the speed of change is unprecedented, right? They industrialize and sort of arm themselves so quickly that it is almost difficult to believe, but they managed to do it. The second thing, of course, is that this is a new political and economic system, never been tried before, right? It only existed in Karl Marx writings, and Lenin decides, you know what?
Let's try it.
Let's give this thing a whirl, right? Let's put this into practice. And so here you see there's kind of there's a division between socialism and communism. Socialism is kind of an economic system where everyone kind of contributes in and everyone gets back. Communism is when you have the political system that controls that as well. Okay, so you can have socialist ideas or socialist kind of programs in your country without it being communist, right? Canada has those. Our healthcare system is a socialist idea, right? We all pay into it with our taxes, and then when I need to go to the hospital, I just go. I don't pay for it because it's covered, right? That's a socialist idea, though. And it was actually brought in by a socialist political party, interestingly enough. We don't really have those so much anymore, but at the time we did. And yeah, that is socialism, right? Some of the Americans will think that's a dirty word, but socialism can be good, right? We have pieces of it working in Canada right now. But again, you can have socialist ideas in your country without it being a full communist country, but they're slightly different. Okie dokie. You want to take a little break?
Yes, please.
Me too. Let's do it. When we come back, we'll start with Tsarist Russia. All right, and we are back. So, again, we're kind of starting the story of Russian Revolution because, well, it's important, right, to the history of Russia and to the history of the entire world. And maybe depending what Russia plans to do in the next few years, it might it might become important, for that reason too. To start off, I would like you to read a short section of the textbook here, a few pages and a few questions. Again, it just sort of sets the stage for what's happening in Russia kind of around the time of the First World War, what things are like, and then we'll get into the war, the stepping down of the Tsar, the creation of a provisional government, and then, of course, the Communist Revolution. But we just need a little bit of background first, so I will let you read. I'll put some time on the clock. Not that much, a little bit more time than that. I'll put some time on the clock, and then, of course, we'll talk about these questions, okay? But I'll turn you loose to Yes, we do. Okay, let's try and discuss at least a few of these, okay? I know we've got there's a lot of questions here and there's a few blanks we need to fill in, but we can do it, okay? So, first question is what's the subject of this Russo-Japanese war? Why are the Russians and Japanese fighting in 1905? Did somebody hit on someone's girlfriend, or why are they fighting? Just trying to get your attention here. Why are the Japanese and the Russians fighting in 1905? What are they fighting over?
Revolution.
No. No. Revolution. What are they fighting over? Jim, help me out here. I'm dying up here. Why are the Japanese and the Russians fighting? What's the war about? Okay. Not so much oil yet. Oil kind of comes later. But you're right about the resource thing, right? So there's minerals and there's timber that they're looking for, and where is this? Where are these resources? Nope. In where? I cannot hear you, I'm sorry. Oh, no, it's not in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union doesn't exist in 1905. It's not a thing yet. It's in Manchuria. Sorry, yeah. So it's in Manchuria, right? So in China, the Japanese are trying to industrialize. They need raw materials, and the Russians would like to get their hands on that too, right? And so both sides are trying to take control of that sort of northeastern part of China to gain the natural resources that they need, right? Who's gonna win? Japan's gonna win, right? Oof. Embarrassing, right? Why is that so embarrassing for the Russians? They're huge, right? Who, Russia or Japan?
Russia.
Yeah, they're much bigger, right? They have a bigger population. They're a European power, right? And Asian nations have been, losing battles against European powers for years at this point, right? Because all of that area has been colonized by Western powers, and here the Japanese come out of nowhere and defeat the Russians, right? Embarrassing for the Russians, of course. The Japanese are super stoked about it, right? But the Russians are embarrassed, right? And it doesn't really look good on the Tsar, right? It sort of undermines the Tsar's authority. But there's other issues going on in Russia too, and maybe what kind of things are we hearing about in Russia? What's the state of Russia at this point? They are
mainly because of the loss to Japan.
Because of the what?
Because of the loss to Japan.
The loss to Japan is definitely part of it, right? It does not look good on the government that they have lost to someone that the Russians feel they should have beaten, right? But what else is going on there ripe for revolution? Andre, what were you going to say? What's going on in Russia at this point? Like, what's the state of? Yeah, there's a lot of pushback against the government.
Labor strife and political dissension.
What's political dissension?
And also like the fact that they gave up in World War I. Anything one of the topics.
That'll come a little bit later. But yeah, there's political dissension. There's labor strife, right? So people are striking. Everybody's unhappy. There's food shortages. man, when people go hungry, nobody's happy, right? So everybody's hangry, if you will. What's political dissension?
It's expressions of dissent in the forms of vocal disagreement to civil disobedience and the use of violence.
Okay, so basically people are not doing what they're told anymore, right?
Going
They're
on strike.
Yeah, they're going on strike. They're speaking out against the government. They're protesting with signs outside the Winter Palace, right? Sometimes there's violence mixed in with that as well. People are unhappy, right? And they are loudly telling the government that they are unhappy, right? Food shortages, economic problems. They've just lost a war with Japan. Everything's awful. They want change, right? Let's see. Since I asked you this question, I'll ask you it here. What happens on Bloody Sunday? This is in 1905, right?
Yes. 22nd of January till the 30th of October. From Bloody Sunday.
From the 2nd of January to 30th of October? That's a long Sunday.
Yeah.
I'd like a Sunday like that, actually.
Same.
Yeah, one that lasts like 9 months? Sure.
Bloody Sunday was like the start of all the strikes and everything.
Mm-hmm.
There's Father Gaitman
Mm-hmm.
March on the Winter Place.
Winter Palace, yeah.
The Winter Palace.
The Tsar's pad, if you will, his crib.
And like shots were fired. And a lot of people were killed that day.
Yeah, so it's kind of a demonstration on the Winter Palace, right? A bunch of these workers are bringing their demands to the Tsar, right? Saying we want better working conditions, we want labor laws. The guards get a little bit spooked. They shoot a bunch of people. That's not good either, right? That's going to make people more upset and more upset at the government. What is the Tsar forced to do in about 1905? What does he create?
A representative parliament.
Yeah, he creates a representative parliament. He creates the Duma, right? And the Duma, of course, has people that are in it. They're supposed to represent the people of Russia, right? And they vote on things and pass laws, right? So he's now he's going to share his power, his sort of kingly, czarly power. He's going to share it with this Duma, right? But as you read about, things don't go very well there either, right? Because the Tsar doesn't really want to give up any of his power, right? And so these two are they should be cooperating, but they're not. They're fighting it out, right? So again, nothing's really happening. The Duma is trying to get things done. The Tsar is kind of resisting any of their influence and not allowing them to sort of have any power. So that's not going well either, right? They get pulled into World War I, right? Because they're allied with Serbia, and of course, after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the ostrich, right? After the ostrich is shot, so the Austro-Hungarians invade Serbia. That pulls Russia into the war, and suddenly they're in, right? They are not prepared for it. They don't have a lot of industrial capacity. Their economy is in the, it's pretty crappy to start with, and so they start off in a bad place, right? They've got a lot of men, fortunately, but that's kind of all they've got. And so as you can see in the text, they have massive amounts of losses in the first. Is it 4 million in the first year? Holy cow, right? 4 million. They lose 4 million soldiers in the first year of the war. Unbelievable, right? And again, we know it's a bloody, awful war to start with, but also the Russians are not equipped to fight it, right? They're not trained, they don't have the technology, and so huge numbers of Russians are going to die really, really quickly. Bad news. Okay, that is unfortunately all the time we have, so press pause on that. We'll come back to it tomorrow. We'll sort out the the provisional government, the stepping down of the Tsar, and then Lenin and his Bolsheviks and what they do, okay? So that is it. I will see you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon.